Because when you talk about neocolonialism, how can we really find ourselves and grow and heal and conquer? This is what the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples is all about.
Welcome to Spirit and Liberation, the podcast where we bridge the sacred and the political, where ancestral wisdom meets the front lines of organized movement. Every episode, we bring you into conversation with spiritual practitioners, political organizers, and healers who are weaving ancestral wisdom into the work of liberation. We'll discuss everything from community-based care systems to the often unseen spiritual frameworks that accompany our movements. Whether you're a longtime student or initiate of African and Indigenous spiritual practices, or you're just starting to explore these paths, this space is for you. I'm your host, and my name is Jeanette Charles Marquez, and I'm an organizer, historian, and Ifa practitioner who is deeply committed to liberation. Today, we are in conversation with Iya Akila Jaramogi, a matriarch of land, lineage, and liberation. Iya Akila is the paramount chief of the Merikin Maroons of Trinidad and Tobago, a forester, social entrepreneur, cultural activist, and an unyielding advocate for environmental justice. For 4 decades, she has dedicated her life to the work of reforestation, land healing, and cultural preservation. As the founder and CEO of the Fonzamans Community Reforestation Project in St. Anne's, Trinidad, Iya Akila has pioneered a celebrated model of community forestry. As an American woman, her connection to the land is ancestral, rooted in the legacy of self-determination and sovereignty for African Maroons and Indigenous peoples. Also, as a longtime practitioner of Ifa, Iya Akila's work is guided by her spiritual principles of balance, reciprocity, and alignment with divine order. In this episode, we'll talk about reforestation as a spiritual practice, the legacy of Merikin resistance, and the role of community forestry in fighting climate change, colonialism, and capitalism. But more than that, we'll hear about how the land calls us home, how the trees, the rivers, and the soil hold our stories, our ancestors, and the answers to creating alternative futures. Thank you for joining us today, Iya.
Modupe.
Well, Iya, to start us off, you come from the American community here in southern Trinidad. And for those who may not be familiar with American history, can you share what it means to be part of the American lineage and also how being American shapes the way you move through the world?
I seek permission from my ancestors to speak on their behalf. I offer light and pour libation to all my ancestors, known and unknown. My Merikin Maroon ancestors, on whose shoulders I stand tall and proud. I'm a proud 6th-generation Merikin woman from South Trinidad, and Merikin, the word Merikin derived from the word American. And this word came about simply because our ancestors were not comfortable to be called Americans. And this goes way back from 1812 and beyond. Our ancestors were taken from Africa, mainly West Africa, against their will, and placed on plantations in Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, and Spanish Florida. In 1812, when Cruikshank Proclamation came, calling folks to join the British Army to help fight against America in the War of 1812, our ancestors chose that moment. A lot of them ran away from plantations. A lot of them were already Maroons in forested areas and along the shoreline and other parts, and they decided to join the British Army in exchange for their freedom. So that was a very, very strategic move for our ancestors running away and deciding to, by all means necessary, to get out of America. And the promise that was made at the end to get the British passport out of America, as they would put it, really worked, because at the end of the war, the British ended up losing the war, but they stood by their promise. And out of America in 1814, they were sent to Bermuda on garrison duties. And from Bermuda, they were sent to Halifax in Canada. And that was over 800 Africans. And then to South Trinidad. By 1816, they were settled in Trinidad, in different parts of South Trinidad, now known as the company villages. The first group of soldiers that settled, we call that area First Company, because they settled in the order in which they served during the war. So today we can still visit the First Company area known as Hindustan, and some popular name like Naji Road and Macnish Trace and so on, named after some of the African soldiers that came. And following that, we have the Second Company of soldiers settled, and so on until you reach a Sixth Company. So I grew up in Sixth Company, South Trinidad, and always knowing about the history of my ancestors, my American ancestors, who came as free Blacks, and not just free Blacks, but owning class Blacks, having lands. Each family got 16 acres of land. And today, we are still, in the company villages. My mom is still in the company villages. Our relatives are still there. But we have lost a lot of the lands over the years. But we are still within the company villages, holding on to our ancestral roots.
Thank you for sharing that history, Iya. And I appreciate how you tie in the importance of land and the autonomy or the stewardship that Americans have had here in Trinidad, and the Maroon legacy, right, of fighting for one's freedom, like you said, by any means necessary, right? So this legacy is definitely one that is deeply rich in resistance, liberation, self-determination, and this element of the land. And because you are a steward and custodian of land yourself, how do you see reforestation and land stewardship as part of this broader ecosystem of resistance?
Wow. For me, I have always admired my ancestors, my grandmother, and other elders holding on to the land and seeing the land as sacred and being farmers and so on, and truly attached themselves to the land. And for me as a child, I always loved the forest. And being a young woman and coming to the north, where I started family life very young, with my late husband, Takuma Jaramugi, coming to the north and looking at the forest, I was just attracted to the hills instead of the city. And my late husband, he loved the forest, being a Rasta man, and we started planting in the hills and so on. But he would plant short-term crops during the rainy season, and come dry season, he would move away from the land because of forest fires and so on. But when I started to talk about my ancestors and talk about how my grandmother would say, plant in season and out of season until you catch the right season, meaning don't run away, don't turn away. The forest is sacred, like Oba Igbo, it's sacred. We need to stay connected. And there we started to invest in long-term crops. in St. Anne's in the hills there. And those who know about St. Anne's and the story of fires and so on in the degraded hillside, we stood up against all odds. And I told him, hey, let's invest in long-term farming. And so that was a new responsibility on Takuma and a new responsibility for me as well, because as a child, I didn't have to run from fires. But now making an investment in the hills, an area that was deemed a fire climax zone in Trinidad, we plant long-term trees and long-term crops and cut fire breaks and, just re-educate the community about the sacredness and the value of the forest. And today, we can proudly see the fruit of our labor, that whole transformation, and not just for that St. Anne's watershed, but the entire ecosystem of Trinidad and Tobago, cultivating an energy of care and that custodial energy for watershed management and people and flora and fauna and everything that goes with it. So I am so proud of the teachings that I got as a child in the forest in South Trinidad, and how my ancestors valued the forest, and coming to the north and helping one to appreciate their natural environment. I am so grateful for the teachings that I got. And I always say Ashe and Adupe to my ancestors, my Merikin ancestors, for helping me value and appreciate natural environment. So, with that, I celebrate it. I celebrate the teachings, and I celebrate the legacy that we have created and continue to create in the St. Anne's Hills there. And it's not just about creating a space where both flora and fauna can thrive, but people as well. And also changing the landscape, bringing in that spiritual touch in the space where you can now come and see a shrine, you can now learn about Obatala, you can learn about Oshun, and the different deities that dwell in the forest and around me. So it's creating that space where I can live and practice African spirituality and African life ways.
I really want folks to kind of understand the scale. Your project in Fonzamins, the reforestation project, is such a magical place. Like you said, it's so spiritually imbued. And it's also really expansive. Can you talk a little bit about just the length of time that you've worked in reforesting this piece of land, and the different facets of work within Fonzamins, in addition to the planting of trees and long-term crops? I know you also are doing work around actually teaching people to become firefighters, and there's all these different elements too. So can you talk a little bit about just the scale and how all the different kind of layers of the project?
Oh, thank you. And for me, it was just so and continue to be like an organic flow. So, and because we just started as a couple in the forest, beating drums and praying with our children and planting trees and so on. And then Takuma died in 94. And I had to refocus, I had to evaluate everything and think about whether I should stay in the forest or whether I should go back south Trinidad with my children, young baby children in the forest there, or just do something different. But I choose to stay in the forest. And making that decision meant that I had to re-strategize, restructure. So we had to turn the work of free spirit and free energy into an organization and get registered in the system, and create modules, So the dry season, we'll have the fire prevention program where I was trained as a forest firefighter, an honorary fire guardian with the Trinidad and Tobago Fire Services, both myself and my daughter and some other folks in the community. And we had to come up with that dry season forest fire plan. And also in the rainy season, we had to create a plan to deal with surface runoff management and all the stuff in the rainy season. And other than that, we created a clean tree organic nursery. We looked at sustainable livelihoods, not just for ourselves, but for the community and others around us. So we went straight into the business of ecotourism. And also my natural jewelry, a line of ecological jewelry, all these different modules we had to place within the structure of the organization to ensure that my life goes well and the life of my children and the life of my community. And when we talk about sustainable livelihood and ensure that enterprises being created around us, so we'll always have a cash flow. We'll always be able to survive. And not just survive, but also share the model with other communities, other women who are in similar situation or in situation where they feel like there's no hope or they feel hopeless. Many a times I was called to share my stories with them and to give them hope. So this is what the project, has now become a model, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but throughout the Caribbean and throughout the world, because I've been traveling a lot all over, from Fiji to the UK to Geneva to Germany, all over the Caribbean, sharing this model. And this is the reality of hard work, because it started in 1982 and almost 43 years now. We have been consistent in the delivery of caring and loving Mother Earth and taking nothing and make something, right? And showing people how to value their natural environment. But most of all, look at your life as destiny, it just cultivated into something beautiful. And even though I did not plan it that way, it just mushroomed into a beautiful oasis, and I give thanks. I feel happy when children can come into the forest and touch and feel and climb and just smile and feel privileged to be connected with Mother Earth and be in oneness with nature. So I give thanks all the time.
Yeah, I feel like the project very much, in both how you describe it and how I've also been able to experience, and I know others have been able to experience it, is very much an example of not only what's possible to build kind of our own sustainable communities and an alternative to this capitalist model, right? But also very much rooted in what it means to live a maroon life in today's times, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And it brings me to this part of your work where you're very integral to regional and international efforts to unite African Maroons and Indigenous peoples. And I would like for you to kind of talk about why it's so important to unite and gather Maroon communities from different territories right now in this historical moment, and what you think is possible through that work.
Thanks again for this opportunity to share, because as I said just now, it's all about destiny. And as a child, I was told that my grandfather came from Jamaica and he was a Maroons and he settled in Tobago. My father's side of the family is from Tobago. Some of them came from Grenada and settled in Tobago. And my grandfather came from Jamaica and settled in Tobago, Mason Hall to be direct. And whereas my grandmother and my mother's side and everyone settled in, they're the Merikins from South. So hearing about Maroons, I always knew that there was something more that I had to do on this land. And in finding myself and advocating for Americans, I came across one Maroon leader from Suriname. And she said, you're the Maroons, right? And that legacy that is there with you, you all need to talk about it some more. So I started researching, and eventually we signed, 3 countries signed an agreement to work together. That's Trinidad, Jamaica, and Suriname. And me being in the position that I placed myself in my Merikin community through the Merikin Heritage Foundation, I find myself in this leadership position, taking on a lot of the work, exploring different parts of the Caribbean and finding Maroons. And that was in 2014. Then in 2019, we went to the UN seeking Indigenous people status for all Maroons of the diaspora. And then I went to Dominica in search of Maroons because the history would just allow you, the colonizers did such a good job to bury the history of our ancestors who revolted, to bury this history of liberators and freedom seekers, and those who rebel against the oppressive system of slavery. So I was told by one professor, he said, go to Dominica, go, there's some great history about Maroons. They were second to Jamaica in Maroons and Marionage. And I was so happy. I went there on a fact-finding mission first, and I went to different communities and to hear stories of Maroons and so on. And then after, I invited my colleagues from across the Caribbean to hold the first Maroon gathering under the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples in Dominica. And that was just after COVID, like in 2021. So a lot of people were restricted from traveling, but I was so determined to go find my people, to unearth the truth and bring it alive. And even to help those in Dominica self to understand who they are and from whence they came. And so that was one. And being in Dominica, we were able to connect to Guadeloupe and Martinique and St. Lucia, and of course, the 2 other countries, Jamaica and Suriname, and then Barbados, and we were moving around the Caribbean searching for Maroons. We found our relatives in Grenada and the Temne people in Carriacou, all these indigenous African groups that they would never tell you anything about in the history books. We were able to find them. So from then to now, I continue to rally in search of my Maroon relatives across the Caribbean and the Americas. And in this search, I'm coming out with a lot of positive, results. And this is where we are today. Just last year, we held our second Maroon gathering in Trinidad, bringing Maroons together. And we had IAT on board this year, and we had sisters from Brazil, and, we have the Garafunas from Belize and so on board with us. And this is just growing, and it is so fascinating to be able to see results from the work. And this is not coming from top down. It's coming from the grassroots people on the ground, finding themselves and unearthing the truth and getting into the schools and getting to professors and so on, who will now take up this as a study and help, our people to bring the truth alive of liberators and celebrate the work of those who have done, great work before. As we gather celebrating Maroons, we celebrate Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther, Bob Marley, Malcolm X, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, we Kwame Ture. We call the names of these ancestors who cleared the path for us and continue to clear the path. Yeah, Asha.
I'm curious, for you, what does a reparative future or a future that's rooted in reparations look like for Maroon and Indigenous communities? And how do you think spiritual practices, because that came up a lot too, but spiritual practices like Ifa and other Indigenous traditions support these practices and these demands around reparations and repair?
Yeah. For me, looking at a reparative future as a conversation we were having at the conference, how can we get our people to deal with the trauma of Mafa and move on? How can we get our African descent people to really understand what the oppressive system have done to us, how much damage, how much pain, that we are still going through, how traumatized our people are still, and how can we heal, both spiritually and carnally, from those traumas. And when we look at all the built-in racism and all the stuff that we have to deal with, we then took that moment, as you said, we were talking about how can we move on, how can we identify the ills in society following that whole experience, 500 years of oppression, and it still exists today. Because when you talk about neocolonialism, how can we really find ourselves and grow and heal and conquer? And this is what the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples is all about. It's about healing. It's about finding oneself. It's about strategizing. It's about creating a path where we can see ourselves victorious and not victims. Empower each other to understand that we cannot move forward without tapping into our spiritual self. What has been taken away from us, our language, our African spirituality, our way of feeling ourselves, this is what we have to reclaim. This is what, when we talk about restorative justice, restore and heal. And this is what the United Maroon Indigenous Peoples, this is the path that we have placed before ourselves as leaders, to get into the community, to be foot soldiers, to reach our brothers and sisters and the children, and even sit in places among decision makers and demand justice, demand what is rightfully ours, So through the conference, year one and the other year, we have created a declaration declaring the rights to truth, the rights to rights, the rights to land, the rights to live as a sovereign people, right? So these are some of the paths that we have chosen, and we continue to advocate for these rights, and we will not back out. This is the time we say, arise, you Black scholars, come demand your cultural wealth. Come now and teach your Black people the greatness of being self. And we say, give we back we language and we culture. We want back our languages. Our children have the rights, to speak Yoruba, Swahili, Fulani, Bemba, Zulu, Mande, Akan, Igbo, Hausa. And why are we just lumped with the English and Spanish and French and Dutch and Portuguese? No. The time is now, and we are advocating for these rights as a people, as the Maroon peoples of the diaspora, and we will not stop. Our children, we want them to recognize that they have been fed with the medicine of lies. Now we want the medicine of truth. We want to talk about the education system, and we'll continue to talk about the education system that is full of lies. Hence the reason why we are saying we are unearthing the truth. In Trinidad, you still have Picton and all these murderers, Columbus and all of them, King George and this and that. These names, as we call the street names and we talk about these murderers, their energy continued to grow. Now we have to talk about our ancestors more. We want to see street names with our ancestors. We want to see Papa Nisa, Ma Rodney, Shango Omi. We want to see these names in our streets, the corners, and we want to continue to pray and give us back our African spirituality, the truth. Because the gods we pray to answer our cries, they didn't give us a life to just suffer and die. As you would hear in the past, talking about you have sinned and fall short of the glory, and all the little baby children have to say these things. No, there's hope, there's beauty in African spirituality when we can shake the shak and call, Oremiye Jaja for me, Edamiye Jaja for me, fight for us, ancestors, fight for us. And we can pray and sing and give thanks to Obatala and give thanks to Olodumare, for blessing us. This is the kind of education that we want for our children. And I am hopeful it is happening. Our conference and gathering in Trinidad, as we roll into communities, we went to Table Land, and you see the children singing and praying and dancing and feeling comfortable with themselves because they have been able to find a part, that African self, African spirituality, which is so great, which is so real. So I give thanks all the time. We call on Oshun and Oya and Shango and my deity, Obatala, the wise old man, Oba Igbo, Oba Lufun. I give thanks all the time for finding self. And if I can find self, others can. That's why I'm hopeful. Ashe.
If you had one message or one piece of advice to offer to this current generation of freedom fighters and African and Indigenous spiritual practitioners, what would it be?
Let's continue to appease our African ancestors, our Maroon ancestors who set the path as liberators and freedom seekers for the better good of all. Let's continue to follow in the path of our ancestors. They never failed us. And we have been fed with lies all these years. Now we want to be fed with the medicine of truth. And finding African spirituality under the liberty that we offered the people, you can find yourself. There's hope. And as long as you're part of United Maroon Indigenous Peoples, you will reap the benefit of hope and goodness and blessings. So again, I give thanks for this moment, and I encourage all to seek self, seek beyond what we are fed with. Seek truth. Explore your rights, the rights to truth and the rights to rights. And every little thing gonna be all right. Ashe.
Yes. And Iya, as we kind of move towards the end of this conversation, I'm curious if there's anything that you'd like to share that we haven't talked about yet and that you feel is really important for people to hear right now.
Yeah. Say me wa go home. We really want to go home. Mama Africa is calling. We, the children of the diaspora, we, the children of the Americas and the Caribbean, who have been ripped away from the umbilical cords of our Mama Africa, we want to reconnect. We want to live the lives like our ancestors. We want teachers and practitioners to come within our communities here in the Caribbean. And we want to go home to Mama Africa as well. So that connection, we want to reconnect. We want back our languages. We want our art. We want our music. We want our fashion. We want our food. But most of all, we are hungry for our African spirituality. We are hungry to know the truth of our ancestors and our gods. And this is the time. The time is now. The time is now. And with the rights that we have, as we talk sustainable development goals and basic human rights and all the UN, at the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent and all these other forums that are being created, we celebrate another decade for people of African descent. We are part of this great legacy and we still feel cut off. Please, we are begging, Mama Africa, come closer to us. And we hope one day that we can go home to Mama Africa and unite our people. But our children need hope. Our children need to know they are part of this great legacy. Young men in the Caribbean who live hopelessly with their heads down and their pants down, we want them to raise their heads and walk in grace and pride and glory, knowing that they are part of this great legacy. This is what we need. This is what we have been robbed from. We want to reconnect with Mama Africa. We don't want to be products of the colonizers. We want to be product of our ancestors, great kings and queens, our children striving towards the glory of Africa, Al-Kibulan. This is what we want. And I know, I'm hopeful that it will happen one day. Ashe.
Would you be willing to offer any sort of final blessing, prayer, song, or affirmation for folks who are listening to the podcast, something that they can carry with them long after they've listened to this episode?
Yes, thank you. I just want to say gratitude. But first, I pay homage to my deity. Iba Obatala, Iba Oba Igbo, Iba Enli Ifun, Ofikoko Alarumo, Orishanimasen, Orishanimasen. Ashe, Ashe, Ashe. I give thanks. I give thanks. I call on my ancestors. I give thanks as I call on the great ones, known and unknown, seen and unseen, ancestors who were abused, raped, murdered, lied, tricked, deceived and died tragically during the Middle Passage. Openifuno loru. Iba Olodumare oba jikemoji loni. Mo wokunu abrina ye. Iba ilawore. Ekpeje leri la foni wula ado. Ente Olodumare kopajo iku ida. Iba Olorekbo. Iba se ila orun to the east. Iba se iwo orun to the west. Iba se ariwa to the north. Iba se guso to the south. Iba oba igbalaye, iba orunoke, iba tiwo orun, iba osoro dayo, dayo, dayo. Ashe, ashe, ashe. Modupe, modupe, modupe.
Thank you again for joining us today on Spirit and Liberation, brought to you by the Latinx Therapists Action Network. And a special thank you to Iya Kila Jaramugi for sharing with us her strategies in community-based forestry and uniting African Maroons and Indigenous peoples in these times. If this episode spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone in your circle. Spirit and Liberation is hosted by Francisca Porchas Coronado and Jeanette Charles Marquez. Today's episode was produced and edited by Phil Circus.